Somewhere right now, everything a family spent decades building is being handed from one generation to the next, and the person receiving it has no idea whether she is holding a foundation or a countdown. 70% of families lose the fortune in a single generation, but a small handful pass it down for 100 years and never once break the chain. The difference is not luck, and it has nothing to do with income. It comes down to a set of rules, and I am about to walk you through every single one. Here is why this is the exact moment to understand them. Right now, the United States is living through the largest handoff of money in recorded history. Cerulli Associates projects that roughly $124 trillion will change hands through the year 2048, with more than $100 trillion of it flowing down from baby boomers and the generation above them. Somewhere around 55% of that entire wave moves in the narrow window between 2026 and 2036, which means the money is arriving on doorsteps this decade in real time for millions of ordinary families. And a startling share of that wealth sits with a tiny group. Households worth more than $10 million make up only about 2% of the country, yet they control roughly half of everything about to be passed down. And the money rarely lands where people expect on the first pass. A large share of it moves first from one spouse to another, often to widowed women who suddenly become the decision maker for wealth they may never have managed directly. How that first quiet handoff is handled tends to decide whether the fortune even survives long enough to reach the children. Now here is the uncomfortable part. A 20-year study by the Williams Group followed more than 3,000 wealthy families and found that 70% lost the wealth by the second generation and 90% lost it by the third. Family businesses fare no better. Only 3 in 10 survive into the second generation, 12 in 100 reach the third, and barely 3 in 100 make it to the fourth. The old proverb calls it shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations, and the sobering truth is that these numbers have barely moved in decades, even as trusts and tax strategies grew more sophisticated. Old money families sit almost entirely inside that surviving 10%, not because they are more disciplined by birth, but because they run their money by a rule book that gets taught at the dinner table and almost never leaves the house. You are about to get the whole thing, grounded in the real numbers for 2026. Let us start with the rule that everything else is built on. Rule 1. Own the things that grow and refuse the things that rot. The fastest way to understand old money is to look at what they buy, and far more importantly, what they refuse to buy. New money buys things that lose value the moment they are touched. The car, the watch, the boat, the endless upgrade. Old money buys things that quietly gain value while they sleep, including land, cash-producing real estate, ownership in real businesses, and broad index funds that hold hundreds of companies at once. The distinction sounds almost too simple, and that is exactly why it gets ignored by the people who need it most. Here is the machine underneath it. A dollar parked in something that appreciates does not just sit there. It compounds. $10,000 left alone at a 7% return becomes about $76,000 in 30 years, and if it stays untouched across a longer family horizon of 50 years, it grows to nearly $300,000. The family did nothing except refuse to sell. Run that same dollar through a depreciating lifestyle, and it disappears into repairs, insurance, storage, and the next upgrade, leaving nothing behind to hand anyone. There is a hidden enemy in this rule too, and its name is idle cash. Money sitting in a typical checking or savings account is quietly shrinking. The national average savings rate in 2026 is around 1/3 while inflation has historically run near 3% a year. At 3% inflation, the buying power of lazy money is cut in half in roughly 24 years. Even a strong high-yield savings account paying around 4% barely keeps pace once you account for what prices are doing. $50,000 sitting at 4% grows to about $162,000 over 30 years, while the same $50,000 invested for growth at 7% becomes more than $380,000. Old money never lets a large pile sit still. Every dollar is either working or being spent on purpose, and there is very little in between. So the wealthy treat each purchase as a fork in the road. One path buys an asset that can one day feed a grandchild. The other buys a liability that will need feeding for the rest of its life. Wealthy families are not allergic to nice things. They simply make the nice things wait until the assets are large enough to pay for them out of pocket. The lifestyle is the reward the portfolio hands out, never the thing the portfolio gets sacrificed for. There is a second trap hiding inside the things people buy, and old money quietly calls it the lifestyle multiplier. Almost every large purchase drags a chain of smaller ones behind it. A boat needs a trailer, a hitch, fuel, storage, insurance, and a steady stream of repairs. A bigger house needs furniture, higher utilities, landscaping, and property taxes that never stop climbing. The wealthy calculate the full ecosystem of a purchase before they ever sign for it, which is exactly why a family that looks like it could afford anything so often chooses to buy almost nothing. Rule 2. Stay invisible. There is a version of wealth that shouts and a version that whispers, and only one of them lasts. The families who keep money for a century are almost impossible to spot in a parking lot. Modest cars, ordinary houses in good school districts, nothing on the wrist that announces anything at all. This is not humility for its own sake. Invisibility is a financial strategy with a hard dollar figure attached to it. Consider two households earning the same $200,000 a year. Vera runs her life quietly and saves a quarter of what she earns, $50,000 a year, and invests every bit of it. Over 25 years at 7%, that grows to more than $3 million. Her neighbor earns the identical income, but pours most of it into visible signals of success and manages to save only 5%, $10,000 a year. Same salary, same city, same starting line. After 25 years, the quiet saver is sitting on more than $3 million, while the loud spender has around $600,000. The gap was never about the paycheck. It was about who needed to be seen. Visible wealth also carries a hidden tax that never shows up on any statement. Once a family builds an image, every year demands fresh spending to prove the image is still true. The display never stops asking to be fed. Invisible families opt out of that game entirely, and the money they never wasted trying to look rich is the exact money that is still there when their children need it. There is a quiet freedom in it as well. When your identity is not tied to what you own, a bad year cannot humiliate you, and that steadiness is its own kind of inheritance. Rule 3. Move the money while you are still alive. Plenty of families assume inheritance is something that only happens after a funeral. Old money treats it as something you do slowly, deliberately, and mostly while you are still around to watch it work. The tax code quietly rewards this, and in 2026, the rules are unusually generous thanks to a law that made the current limits permanent. Every single year, you are allowed to give away $19,000 to any person you choose, with no tax and without even filing a form. A married couple can give $38,000 per person per year. Give to 3 grandchildren, and a couple can move well over $100,000 a year completely out of their taxable estate, legally and quietly. Take Loretta and Harold, a couple who started funneling $38,000 a year into an investment account for 1 grandchild. Over 20 years at 7%, that stream grows to more than $1.5 million, even though they only ever contributed $760,000 out of pocket. The child wakes up at 20 holding a fortune, and the grandparents watched every dollar of it grow. There is a second door that almost no one notices. You can pay tuition or medical bills for anyone in any amount with zero gift tax as long as you pay the school or the hospital directly. A grandparent can cover $100,000 of college costs on top of the yearly gift, and none of it counts against a single limit. Old money uses this constantly. They pay the tuition, they cover the surgery, they fund the first home, all while alive, all tax-free, all watched with their own eyes. Moving money early does something the will can never do. It lets you teach as you give and correct course while you still can. Rule 4. Let death reset the tax clock. This one sounds grim, and it happens to be the single most valuable line in the entire rulebook, so stay with me here. When you sell an investment that has grown, you owe capital gains tax on all of that growth. But when you die and leave that same investment to your heirs, something remarkable happens. The tax basis resets to the value on the day you died. Every dollar of growth that built up over your lifetime is simply erased for tax purposes. The financial world calls it the step up in basis. Watch how large this gets in practice. Odette bought company stock decades ago for $100,000, and by the end of her life, it was worth $1 million. Had she sold it herself, she would have owed tax on $900,000 of gain. Roughly $180,000 handed straight to the government. Instead, she held it until death and left it to her daughter. The basis stepped up to a full $1 million. Her daughter could sell it the next morning and owe almost nothing on the sale. This is why old money follows a habit that sounds backward until you understand it. They gift away cash and newer assets while alive because those carry little built-in gain, and they hold their oldest, most appreciated assets until death, because death washes the tax away. The family stock, the original land, the founding shares of the business, those get held with an iron grip and passed down at the grave, gain-free. New money sells at the top and pays the tax. The wealthy hold until the clock resets and hand their heirs a clean slate. Rule 5. Build the walls before you fill the house. A pile of money with no structure around it is simply a target. It is exposed to lawsuits, divorces, bad marriages, creditors, and the plain human tendency of an heir to spend a lump sum the moment it lands. Old money almost never hands wealth over as a naked check. They pour it into structures first, and the most common structure is the trust. A trust is a legal container that holds assets and releases them under rules the family writes in advance. Money can be set to release slowly, tied to age, or reserved for education, a first business, or a home rather than a fast car at 22. The wealth stays protected from a divorcing spouse or a lawsuit because, in the eyes of the law, the trust owns it, not the heir. Families also lean on what is called the generation skipping exemption, which in 2026 lets $15 million per person, or $30 million for a married couple, pass all the way down to grandchildren without being taxed twice on the trip. That $15 million exemption was just made permanent, which is why old money is planning with unusual confidence this year. The reason the structure matters is that the tax above those limits is brutal. Anything in an estate beyond the exemption is taxed at a top federal rate of 40%. An estate that sits $10 million above the line can hand $4 million to the government instead of the family. At the very top of the pyramid sit family offices, private teams that run the money like a business. A structure the Rockefellers and the Morgans pioneered more than a century ago. You do not need a family office to use the idea. You need to decide that your wealth deserves a container before it deserves a spender. Structure guards against people just as much as it guards against taxes. A well-drafted trust can shield an inheritance from a child's future divorce. from a lawsuit aimed squarely at a wealthy heir and from creditors who would love nothing more than one fat, unprotected account. This is also why quiet prenuptial agreements are simply standard in old money families, not as an insult to a marriage, but as a fence around wealth that took generations to build. The aim is always the same: to make sure the fortune survives the ordinary messiness of real human lives. If you are finding real value in this, do me one favor and subscribe and stick around, because the rules coming up are the ones that truly separate the families who keep wealth for 100 years from the ones who lose it in 20. Now let us keep going, because structure alone is never enough. The next rule is the one almost every failing family skips entirely. Rule 6. Raise stewards, not spenders. Here is a fact that should stop every parent cold. When researchers dug into why family fortunes collapse, the cause was almost never a market crash or a botched tax move. Around 60% of failed wealth transfers traced back to a breakdown in communication inside the family. And another 25% came from heirs who were simply never prepared to handle what they received. Roughly 85% of the failures were human, not financial. The money did not vanish because of the economy, it vanished because of the people. Old money understands that the wealth and the skill to hold the wealth are two completely different inheritances. And the second one is worth far more than the first, so they teach it on purpose. Children learn how the money was actually made and what it cost the people who made it. They are handed small amounts to manage early and allowed to make small mistakes while the stakes are still low. They sit in on family money conversations instead of being shielded from them like the topic is shameful. By the time real wealth reaches them, they have been quietly training for it for 20 years. The families who fail do the exact opposite. They hide the money, avoid the conversation, and hope the children figure it out after the will is read aloud. Then they are shocked when an heir who was never taught anything treats a windfall like it fell out of the sky. Wealth handed to an untrained person is not a gift. It is a countdown. Old money spends decades making sure the person receiving the fortune already thinks like the person who built it, because a trained heir protects the money and an untrained one becomes the reason it disappears. Rule 7. Start the compounding clock the day a child is born. Time is the one advantage that cannot be bought back later, and old money spends it lavishly on the young. The earlier a dollar starts growing, the less any single dollar has to do, because compounding does the heavy lifting across decades that no working adult will ever get back once they are gone. Look at what a small head start becomes. Imagine a teenager, call him Silas, who earns a little income from a summer job, and his family funds a retirement account for him with $7,000 a year from age 16 to 22. That is only 7 years and $49,000 of contributions, and then it stops completely and forever, left alone to grow at 7% until he turns 65. That single account crosses $1 million, built entirely from money that was in place before he finished college. A parent scrambling to save the same million in their 50s would have to shovel in many times as much, because they are fighting the clock instead of using it. There is even a modern tool for the money that gets left over. A college savings account that has been open at least 15 years can now roll up to $35,000 into a young person's retirement account, tax-free, with no income limit blocking it. $35,000 growing quietly for 40 years becomes more than $500,000. The lesson old money internalizes is that the first dollars matter far more than the last dollars. A family that plants the seed at birth has time working as a silent partner, and that partner never sleeps, never panics, and never asks for a raise. Rule 8. Never sell the goose and borrow against it instead. This is the rule that quietly powers the very top of the wealth ladder. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it anywhere. When ordinary people need money, they sell something. And selling triggers a taxable event that shrinks the pile. When old money needs money, they refuse to sell the asset that is busy growing and about to receive that step up at death. They borrow against it instead. Follow how it works with Bo, who owns a portfolio and a building that are both appreciating year after year. He needs cash, so rather than selling and paying tax, he takes a loan using those assets as collateral. The assets keep growing untouched, the loan gives him liquidity to live on or reinvest, and because a loan is not income, there is no tax bill attached to it. He keeps the golden goose, he keeps the eggs, and he spends borrowed money at a fraction of the cost of selling. Eventually, the assets pass at death, the basis steps up, the loan is settled from the estate, and the family repeats the cycle. Wealth planners have a blunt name for the whole loop, and they call it buy, borrow, die. You do not need a private banker to absorb the principle underneath it. The point is to stop treating your growing assets as a piggy bank to be smashed the second life gets expensive. Families who last protect the engine at all costs and find other ways to fund a hard year. The ones who fail crack the engine open, spend the seed, and watch the compounding they spent decades building reset all the way back to zero. Protecting the asset is often worth more than any single thing you could have bought by selling it. Rule 9. Govern the family like an institution. The final rule ties the other 8 together because rules with no system to enforce them are just good intentions written on a napkin. Families who hold wealth for a century stop thinking of themselves as a family that happens to have money and start thinking of themselves as an institution that happens to be related. In practice, that means the wealthy family runs itself with the machinery of an organization. They hold regular family meetings where the money is discussed openly rather than whispered about. They write down shared values and a shared vision so everyone knows what the wealth is actually for. Many draft what amounts to a family constitution, a document that spells out how decisions get made, how disputes get settled, and what is expected of anyone who benefits from the money. They bring in outside advisors who owe the family honesty rather than flattery, because a yes man near a fortune is a slow leak. None of this is glamorous, and that is precisely the point. The 90% who lose everything treat wealth as a private pile that each generation is free to burn as it pleases. The 10% who keep it treat wealth as a shared trust that each generation is only borrowing from the future. That single shift in mindset from owner to steward is the quiet difference between a fortune that dies with its founder and one that is still growing when the founder is nothing but a photograph on the wall. A family that governs itself well can survive a foolish heir. A family with no governance rarely survives even a wise one. There is a reason the third generation is where things so often break apart. The founder knew scarcity and feared losing everything, so they built with relentless discipline. Their children watched that discipline up close and mostly held on to it. But by the third generation, the struggle has become a bedtime story. The money feels like weather that was simply always there, and the hunger that created the fortune has faded to almost nothing. Old money fights this on purpose by keeping the origin story alive, retelling exactly how the first dollar was earned, so that comfort never fully erases the memory of the climb that made it all possible. So there it is, the whole rule book that old money teaches in private and almost never says out loud. Own things that grow and refuse things that rot. Stay invisible. Move money while you are alive. Let death reset the tax clock and wrap everything in structure. Raise stewards instead of spenders. Start the compounding clock the day a child is born. Borrow against the goose instead of selling it. And run the family like an institution built to outlast everyone inside it. Not one of these rules requires being born rich to begin. Each one only requires a decision to think in generations instead of paydays. And if you want the foundation that sits underneath all of it, the money lessons schools never taught, that is the natural next step from right here. Now I genuinely want to hear from you, because this next part matters more than anything I just said. Which of these 9 rules did your family actually teach you, and which one are you learning for the very first time today? Did you grow up watching money get built or watching it quietly disappear? And what would you do differently now that you know the rules the wealthy so rarely hand down to the rest of us? Tell me your story down in the comments. Tell me what you learned, what you wish someone had told you 10 years ago, and which one of these rules you are going to start using first in your own life. I read them, and the stranger scrolling past your comment might be the exact person who needed to hear it today.